what if the biggest threat to your life's work isn't failure or vocal critics or even bankruptcy? What if the biggest threat is just absolute silence?
Yeah, that's a really heavy thought to start with.
Right. Because, culturally, we are conditioned to believe that if we build something meaningful, there will be noise, like a clash, a triumph, some kind of loud debate.
There often isn't.
Exactly. And so for today's deep dive, we're taking a step back from that noise. We're looking at what happens when you are laying a foundation in the dark and literally nobody is walking by to notice.
I think it's a profoundly difficult psychological space to inhabit. For this deep dive, we're synthesizing a fascinating sociological essay alongside some psychological case studies. And they explore this highly specific state called the loneliness of conviction.
The loneliness of
All
conviction.
right. Yeah. Our mission today is to sort of dissect what happens structurally and emotionally when you continue to believe in a project or a vision
Hmm.
long after the initial excitement has faded and when the prevailing culture is just, completely stopped paying attention.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to set the parameters right away. We are not, and I mean we are absolutely not indulging in that romanticized cliche of the starving, misunderstood genius shaking their fist at an ignorant world.
I'm so glad you brought that up first
Right.
because the sources explicitly reject that victim narrative.
Right, it's just so played out.
It really is.
Mm.
Framing yourself as a martyr is essentially just a demand for attention wrapped in a grievance. What we're analyzing today is much more grounded, and frankly, it's much heavier.
Yeah.
The loneliness we're talking about is not a tragedy. It's simply a structural byproduct of being out of sync with prevailing systems of recognition.
So to understand how you even end up in that out-of-sync state, we first have to define what conviction actually is.
Yes.
And the essay does this by contrasting it with its loudest counterpart, which is enthusiasm. But I'll admit, reading through the case studies, I initially found the distinction a bit muddy.
How so?
Well, aren't enthusiasm and conviction essentially the same fuel, just burning at different temperatures?
I wouldn't quite phrase it that way.
Yeah.
It's not just a difference in temperature. It is a completely different biological and structural mechanism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because enthusiasm is inherently social. It's highly reactive. It operates on immediate dopamine loops.
Like social media likes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about a viral launch or a new trend or, the honeymoon phase of a startup. Enthusiasm requires external mirroring to survive. Someone praises your idea, that gives you a hit of
You
energy.
take the next step.
Right, you take the next step, they applaud again. It is loud, it's contagious, and by definition, it is temporary.
Okay, so enthusiasm is essentially outsourced energy. You are relying on the environment to keep the engine running.
Precisely. Conviction, on the other hand, operates almost entirely independent of those external dopamine loops.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The essay notes that conviction has a much heavier, quieter texture. It is the capacity to maintain internal coherence without external reinforcement. It doesn't need an audience to exist, which is exactly why it's so incredibly difficult to sustain.
Okay, let me bring in an analogy here to make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this. Because we do confuse the two so often.
Sure, go for it.
If enthusiasm is a sparkler, it's bright, it crackles, everybody looks at it, but it relies on a very fast, aggressive chemical reaction that just burns out in 30 seconds,
Right.
then conviction is more like a low-burning ember in a masonry heater. It doesn't look flashy at all. Like, you might walk right past it. But
Yeah.
because of its density, it's the thing that actually keeps the house warm through a long, freezing night.
That captures the physics of it perfectly.
Mm.
A sparkler versus a masonry heater.
Yeah.
And here's where the structural loneliness begins. Our current culture is heavily optimized to measure, reward, and distribute sparklers.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
We have built massive economic and algorithmic systems designed to track momentum, novelty, and immediate visible traction.
Right. Algorithms don't know how to measure an ember.
Exactly.
If a creator's work can't be neatly categorized, or, if an intellectual is working on a 10-year timeline rather than a 10-second pitch, they simply fall out of the visibility matrix.
And that misalignment is crucial to understand.
Yeah.
The sociological text emphasizes that this lack of visibility does not invalidate the work. The loneliness is structural.
Meaning it's built into the system.
Yes, if you're doing something that requires a long timeline or you're holding a direction that just doesn't fit the current cultural vocabulary, the societal mechanisms to reward you simply haven't been built yet.
You're operating outside the scaffolding.
Precisely. You're outside the scaffolding. So the silence isn't a judgment on your capability. It's just a reflection of the timeline you are working on.
But wait, I have to push back on that a little bit
Okay, go ahead.
because it's very easy to sit here in a studio and say, well, the silence isn't a judgment on your capability. But when you are living it day to day, the silence feels exactly like a judgment.
It absolutely does.
We naturally look around, we see that we don't have that loud, visible momentum, and we assume the work must be fundamentally flawed. I mean, how does an individual actually survive the day-to-day pressure of that quiet?
That is the core psychological pressure the case studies focus on. They identify a phenomenon called the fatigue of conviction.
The fatigue of conviction.
Yeah. And we need to separate this from typical burnout or, the physical exhaustion of overwork.
So it's not just working too many hours.
No, not at all. The fatigue of conviction is a highly specific cognitive load. It is the cumulative grinding weight of sustained belief in a vacuum.
I want to dig into that concept of the vacuum. Here's where it gets really interesting, because culturally, we are trained to expect the exact opposite. We love the hero's journey, where there's a clear antagonist. Like, we picture the vocal critic telling us we'll never make it, or the massive financial hurdle we have to violently smash through.
Right, the underdog story.
Yeah, we think conviction is forged in battle.
And that is a Hollywood narrative that the psychological data completely contradicts. The ultimate test of conviction is not opposition. The ultimate test is indifference.
Let's explore the mechanics of that. Why is indifference so much more destructive than active opposition? Because, if someone is actively fighting my idea, shouldn't that be harder to overcome than someone just ignoring me?
Actually, no, because active opposition provides friction. And human beings can use friction for momentum.
Oh, I see.
If someone tells you your project is terrible, that gives you a wall to push against. It generates spite or motivation, or at the very least, a clear boundary of where your idea ends and the culture begins.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Opposition is a form of feedback. It tells you that your work is visible enough to threaten or annoy someone.
It's an acknowledgement of existence.
Exactly. Indifference provides neither friction to push against nor momentum to ride along with. It is a profound, heavy neutrality.
Wow.
When you operate in that vacuum, your brain doesn't have the environmental cues it normally relies on to automate habits or confirm decisions.
So you're just floating.
You're floating. Therefore, every single day you sit down to work, you have to consciously self-generate the rationale for why you're doing it.
Oh, that seems exhausting.
It is. You have to answer the question, do I still believe in this enough to continue? And having to answer that question entirely on your own day after day burns an immense amount of cognitive and emotional energy.
It's like sensory deprivation. Without gravity or resistance, you just lose your sense of orientation.
That's a great way to put it.
And the text mentions that many incredible practices, artistic projects, deep scientific inquiries, they quietly dissolve in this exact space.
Very often, yes.
Not because the individual lacked talent and not because they were dramatically defeated by a rival.
Yeah.
They dissolve simply because the silence became too heavy.
And we shouldn't romanticize that dissolution either. Abandoning a long-term vision just to escape the sheer discomfort of that cognitive vacuum is a very common, very unglamorous reality.
Right. It's just human nature.
Exactly. Existing in a state of structural loneliness is deeply uncomfortable. Humans are social primates. We are biologically wired to seek consensus.
We want the pack to agree with us.
We do.
Yeah.
When you operate without it, your nervous system is constantly humming with a low-level alarm.
Which naturally leads to what I think is the most dangerous psychological trap mentioned in all the sources.
The stubbornness trap.
Yes, yeah. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment. If you were sitting in that vacuum, completely ignoring the fact that the culture doesn't care about your work, and you just keep pushing forward without any external validation, isn't that just textbook delusion?
It can look like it.
How do you know you aren't just being foolishly rigid? We have to be able to separate true conviction from mere stubbornness, because from the outside, they look absolutely identical.
That is the most critical distinction in this entire analysis. Both the stubborn person and the person with conviction are persisting in the face of indifference.
Right.
But internally, their operating mechanics are completely opposed. The psychological case studies define stubbornness as a state that freezes. It is an active resistance to reality.
Let's unpack the how of that. How does the stubborn brain process the silence compared to the convicted brain?
Think of stubbornness as a closed-loop algorithm. It has a rigid set of instructions, and it actively rejects any new data that doesn't confirm its pre-existing bias.
So they just plug their ears.
Basically, the stubborn individual views the lack of cultural response as a hostile act. They lock into a single methodology, refuse to adapt, and essentially demand that the ocean accommodate them.
But conviction is different.
Conviction is fundamentally different. It is an open source model. It is highly responsive to the environment.
So you aren't ignoring the silence.
Not at all. You are acutely listening to the silence. You process the fact that your current iteration didn't land, you take in that data, and you update your code.
You adapt.
Yes, you refine your skills, you change your daily habits, you might completely overhaul the medium you're working in. The methods constantly evolve.
But the core remains.
Exactly. What remains unchanged, what stays protected, is the core operating system. The fundamental values and the ultimate destination do not shift.
I love that. Stubbornness rejects the data to protect the ego. Conviction uses the data to protect the work.
That's beautifully said.
It's like navigating a ship. Stubbornness is lashing the wheel in one direction, walking below deck, and completely ignoring a changing wind, secretly hoping the wind will just give up.
Which never works.
Right. But conviction is constantly adjusting the sails. You're shifting the rigging. You are highly responsive to the environment. You might even change your route to survive a storm, but you never abandon the coordinates of your final destination.
That's a very accurate translation of the psychology. The loneliness of conviction is not about a refusal to adapt. It is about a refusal to abandon the core integrity of the work just to secure a quick hit of enthusiasm.
But practically speaking, how does a person actively manage that?
It's hard.
If you're committed to not freezing like the stubborn person, but you're also committed to not abandoning the destination, you still have to deal with the isolation. I mean, you can't just grit your teeth for 20 years.
You can't. And the sociological essay argues that the only way to survive is through a fundamental reframing of what the isolation actually represents.
A reframing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to stop viewing the lack of immediate recognition as evidence of failure. Instead, you must reframe the isolation as a condition of integrity.
A condition of integrity, meaning the silence isn't a punishment for doing it wrong. The silence is simply the required atmosphere for the specific thing you were building.
Exactly. It requires what the author calls patience without guarantee.
Wow. Patience without guarantee.
And we really need to pause on that phrase because it removes the safety net we usually rely on.
It really does. You aren't enduring the silence because you secretly know there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Right.
You aren't playing a long game of 4D chess where you assume society will eventually wake up and carry you on their shoulders.
Right. There is no implied promise that eventually they'll all understand. That is the romanticized narrative creeping back in.
The Hollywood version again.
Exactly. The sober reality of conviction is that the work might never find an audience in the way you originally expected. You endure the process because the work itself demands fidelity, period.
So if an individual actually manages to navigate this, if they process the data without freezing into stubbornness, and they accept this patience without guarantee, what happens to them over the span of a decade or two?
That's where it gets really fascinating.
Because the sociological text reveals a shift in how a person's relationship with the outside world fundamentally matures.
The maturation process is profound. And it mostly centers on how they process recognition. Over time, the desperate biological need for external validation changes.
It goes away.
Well, to be clear, it doesn't mean you become some sort of ascetic monk who hates applause.
Right, we're still human.
Exactly. Approval remains welcome. Visible momentum is helpful when it happens. But it is no longer decisive. It no longer dictates whether you continue.
The direction of the work stabilizes internally. You basically become your own weather system.
You do.
But the essay is very blunt about the fact that this maturation comes with a severe cost. It's not a flawless victory.
No, it's a heavy trade-off. This kind of internal stability inherently limits your immediate opportunities.
Because you aren't playing the game anymore.
Precisely. Because you are no longer chasing every shiny new trend, and you are no longer molding yourself to fit the current algorithmic demand, your visibility slows down significantly.
You drop off the radar.
You become highly selective about collaboration, which means you miss out on the fast, superficial networking that builds a quick personal brand.
I mean, it sounds like career suicide in today's attention economy. You're basically saying that an individual in this state is actively trading the potential for quick, widespread visibility for long-term internal coherence.
They are. And in a culture that tells us visibility is the only currency that matters, that trade looks terrifying from the outside.
Absolutely terrifying.
But the reward for making that trade is the creation of what the source calls a through line.
Let's clarify what that means, because it's a powerful concept.
A through line is an invisible continuity. It is the underlying coherence that holds a practice, a career, or a life's philosophy together across years, across shifting contexts, and regardless of the immediate outcomes of individual projects.
It's the thread that connects a painting you did at 25, a business you started at 35, and a book you wrote at 50. From the outside, those look like totally disconnected moments. The public only sees the fragmented points where your work briefly intersected with cultural visibility, but from within, you can see the single, continuous thread.
And that through line only develops if you refuse to break your own coherence to chase enthusiasm.
Wow.
If we connect this to the broader psychological picture, establishing that through line is the ultimate maturation of the creative or intellectual mind.
Because they don't need the sparkler anymore.
Exactly. The individual simply stops relying on external momentum to justify their internal direction. They stop waiting for the construction crew to cheer, and they just keep laying the foundation.
Which brings us to the final grounded truth from these sources, and I appreciate this so much because it completely refuses to offer a fairy tale ending.
It's very sober.
It says that the loneliness of conviction never completely disappears. You don't reach some enlightened plateau where you are suddenly surrounded by a million people who perfectly understand your soul.
No, the structural misalignment remains. You are still operating on a different timeline than the dominant culture.
Right.
But the case studies note that the character of the loneliness fundamentally changes. Over time, it stops feeling like painful, isolating rejection. It loses that desperate, alarming edge.
It stops being a deficit and it starts feeling like clarity.
Yes.
It becomes a quiet space where the work can actually breathe without being suffocated by the demands of immediate relevance.
Because you have finally accepted that the silence isn't a punishment. It's just the atmosphere of the altitude you have chosen to work at.
I want to highlight the closing orientation from the sociological essay because it is something every single person listening to this deep dive needs to hear.
It's a vital takeaway.
Especially if you are sitting in that vacuum right now, exhausted, wondering if you're crazy for continuing to care about the thing you care about. The text concludes with this thought. You are alone, not because no one cares, but because the path you are on cannot be crowded, and that, in itself, is a form of fidelity.
A form of fidelity that perfectly encapsulates the entire deep dive. You are maintaining loyalty to a vision that hasn't fully materialized yet.
Right.
A path designed for one specific, highly attuned vision simply cannot accommodate the loud, scrambling crowd of general enthusiasm.
So, as we wrap up our analysis of these sources, I want to leave you with a completely different kind of question to chew on.
Go ahead.
We've established that true conviction requires periods of silence and long-term coherence to mature. It requires the ability to endure the vacuum.
It does.
But look at the world we interact with every single day. We live inside hyper-connected, algorithm-driven social networks designed to ensure we never experience a vacuum.
Never. Constant noise.
Constant noise. We are bombarded with immediate microdoses of enthusiasm and feedback for every half-baked thought we post.
The sparklers.
The sparklers everywhere. It makes you wonder. If the biological ability to develop true conviction requires the heavy pressure of silence, are our current digital environments actively destroying our psychological capacity to ever develop it?
That's a terrifying question.
Are we culturally losing the ability to hold a through line simply because we've engineered a world where it's impossible to be properly lonely?
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
We really have to protect our capacity for the quiet.
Exactly. Keep digging.